You do not teach your enemy how to destroy you. But that's exactly what Pedro de Valdivia did. The Spanish conquistador who conquered Chile took a teenage Mapuche boy as his personal servant, made him tend his horses, allowed him to watch military drills, let him observe every tactic and weakness of Spanish warfare. For 7 years, Valdivia trained the man who would kill him. The arrogance wasn't unique to Valdivia. It was institutional, embedded in every conquistador who crossed the Atlantic. In 1550, the Spanish Empire had perfected a formula for conquest that seemed unbreakable. Steel armor deflected arrows, muskets killed at impossible distances, war horses trampled warriors who'd never seen such creatures, and European military tactics, refined through centuries of warfare, crushed indigenous resistance with mathematical precision. The proof was everywhere. The Aztec Empire, controlling 15 million people, fell in 2 years. The Inca Empire, stretching 4,000 miles down the spine of South America, collapsed in 1. From Mexico to Peru, the pattern repeated with brutal consistency. Initial indigenous defiance, 1 or 2 catastrophic defeats, complete submission. The Spanish didn't just believe in their superiority. They had the body count to prove it. A few hundred conquistadors could defeat armies numbering in the tens of thousands. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This was the inevitable result of superior technology meeting inferior tactics. Indigenous peoples were expected to recognize this reality and surrender. Fighting was pointless. Resistance was suicide. The mathematics of steel versus stone, gunpowder versus arrows, cavalry versus foot soldiers. The numbers didn't lie. In southern Chile, the Mapuche were supposed to understand this. They were supposed to see Spanish victories in the north, witness the fall of the Inca, calculate their chances, and submit without forcing the Spanish to slaughter them. That was the merciful option. That was what intelligent peoples did when facing inevitable defeat. But on Christmas Day, 1553, a 21-year-old Mapuche warrior, who'd spent 7 years as a Spanish servant, who'd learned every secret of European warfare, who'd been underestimated and dismissed as a stable boy too broken to be dangerous. That young man put everything he'd learned into practice. His name was Lautaro, and he was about to demonstrate that the conquistadors had made a fatal mistake. They'd assumed technology guaranteed victory. They'd forgotten that tactics can be learned, weapons can be copied, and arrogance makes you vulnerable. What happened next didn't just stop Spanish expansion in Chile. It shattered the myth of inevitable conquest and sparked a resistance that would last 300 years. The longest indigenous military resistance in the history of the Americas. The Spanish thought they were invincible. Lautaro was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. Act 2, the context. Lautaro is approximately 21 years old in 1553. The exact date of his birth is unrecorded. Indigenous peoples in pre-contact Chile didn't maintain the kind of written records Europeans demanded. But Spanish accounts agree he's young, in his early 20s, when he changes the course of history. He wasn't born to lead armies. He was born into the Mapuche people living in the fertile valleys near present-day Concepcion, Chile. The Mapuche, meaning people of the land, number perhaps 1 million spread across central and southern Chile. They're not a unified nation, but rather a collection of independent communities sharing language, culture, and kinship ties. They have no emperor, no central government, no standing army. That decentralization will prove to be their greatest strength. You cannot behead a movement that has no single head. But in 1550, Lautaro doesn't know he'll become a military genius. He's a captive, taken as a young teenager during one of the Spanish raids that followed Pedro de Valdivia's invasion of Chile in 1540. Valdivia, the conquistador who founded Santiago, pushes south with 400 soldiers and thousands of indigenous auxiliaries from Peru. He establishes forts, claims land, demands tribute. And he takes Lautaro as his personal servant, his Yanacona, his stable boy. This decision will cost Valdivia everything. For approximately 7 years, Lautaro lives among the Spanish. He tends Valdivia's horses. He observes Spanish military drills. He watches cavalry formations. He studies how the conquistadors coordinate infantry and mounted soldiers, how they use terrain, how they establish defensive positions. He learns Spanish, learns to ride, learns every detail of European warfare. The Spanish assume he's loyal, or at least broken. They're wrong on both counts. By 1553, the Mapuche resistance is collapsing. Spanish forts dot the landscape south of the Biobío River. Mapuche communities pay tribute in gold. Some Mapuche leaders collaborate with the invaders. The pattern of conquest is following its expected trajectory. Then, in October 1553, Lautaro escapes. He returns to his people and calls a council of war chiefs. What he proposes is revolutionary. Stop fighting the Spanish using Mapuche tactics. Start fighting them using Spanish tactics, improved and adapted to Mapuche strengths. The traditional Mapuche way of war emphasized individual combat, raiding, and ritualized battles. Warriors fought for personal glory, not strategic objectives. Battles ended when one side tired or when enough warriors fell. There was honor in this system, tradition, cultural meaning. Lautaro tells them to abandon it all. The Spanish don't fight for honor. They fight for total victory. To defeat them, the Mapuche must learn to do the same. Some chiefs reject this immediately. Lautaro is young, untested in battle, proposing tactics that feel foreign and wrong. But other chiefs see the logic. The traditional way is failing. The Spanish are winning. Something must change. Lautaro demonstrates. He shows them how Spanish cavalry charges work. Not chaotic stampedes, but coordinated formations designed to break infantry lines. He explains how the conquistadors use combined arms. Cavalry to break formations, infantry to hold ground, arquebusiers to strike from distance. He teaches them the Spanish weakness. Horses panic in dense forest. Heavy armor exhausts soldiers in broken terrain. Small Spanish numbers mean they can't sustain heavy casualties. Most importantly, he tells them this. The Spanish believe they're invincible because technology makes them superior. That belief is their greatest vulnerability. Show them they can bleed. Show them they can lose. Shatter that confidence, and the conquest stops. The chiefs who believe him give Lautaro command of 600 warriors. Not a large force, but enough to test his ideas. The target, Fort Tucapel, a Spanish outpost 50 miles south of the Bio River, commanded by a captain and garrisoned by 52 soldiers. Lautaro's plan is simple but revolutionary. They won't raid the fort and withdraw. They'll destroy it completely and kill every Spaniard inside. They'll prove the conquistadors can be beaten using their own tactics against them. December 25th, 1553. Christmas Day. The date is chosen deliberately. Lautaro knows the Spanish will be distracted, celebrating their religious festival. He surrounds Fort Tucapel with his warriors hidden in the forest. And he waits for Pedro de Valdivia to arrive. Act 3. The impossible action. Valdivia receives word on Christmas morning that Fort Tucapel is under attack. The report comes from a surviving messenger who rode through the night. Hundreds of Mapuche warriors surrounding the fort, coordinated assault, Spanish garrison requesting immediate relief. Valdivia doesn't hesitate. He assembles 60 cavalry and 200 indigenous auxiliary infantry and rides south. 60 Spanish cavalry should be more than sufficient against any indigenous force. In 14 years of campaigning in Chile, this formula has never failed. He reaches Fort Tucapel on December 26th at mid-morning. The fort appears intact but abandoned. No garrison visible. No signs of battle. The gates hang open. It's a trap. Valdivia knows it's a trap. But Spanish military doctrine doesn't allow retreat from threatened garrisons. To withdraw without investigating would be cowardice, would embolden the enemy, would violate everything he believes about Spanish martial superiority. He orders his cavalry forward. The Mapuche attack erupts from the forest on 3 sides simultaneously. Not chaotic charges, coordinated waves designed to envelope the Spanish flanks. Lautaro has divided his 600 warriors into 3 groups of 200, positioning them to attack in sequence, maintaining pressure while allowing warriors to rotate and rest. He learned this from watching Spanish tactics. Now he's using it against them. The first wave strikes at 50 yards. 200 Mapuche warriors emerge from the tree line, running in loose formation, hurling spears and stones. The Spanish cavalry wheels to meet them. Standard response: charge the attackers, break their formations, scatter them. The cavalry charges. The Mapuche don't scatter. They fall back into the forest in organized retreat, drawing the cavalry toward the trees where horses lose their mobility advantage. Valdivia recognizes the tactic. It's what Spanish forces do to draw enemies into kill zones. He orders the cavalry to halt, reform. But while he's reforming, the second wave attacks from a different angle. 200 fresh warriors striking the Spanish rear while the cavalry is still disorganized. The Spanish formation fractures. Some cavalry turn to face the new threat. Others hold position. The coordination breaks down. Individual riders are making individual decisions instead of moving as a cohesive unit. The third wave strikes. 200 warriors hitting the exposed flank where the Spanish line has thinned. The range closes to 30 yards. 20 yards. Hand-to-hand combat. Here's where Lautaro's adaptation proves devastating. The Mapuche have changed their weapons. Instead of traditional short spears, they're carrying long pikes. 12-foot wooden shafts with fire-hardened tips, designed specifically to strike riders before the riders can strike them. They copied the design from Spanish infantry pikes. The weapons are crude but effective. A Mapuche warrior named Galvarino, identified in Spanish accounts because he'll become legendary for other reasons, plants his pike and braces as a Spanish horseman charges. The pike takes the horse in the chest. The animal screams and goes down. The rider, a conquistador named Diego de Maldonado, crashes to the ground in 70 pounds of steel armor. He can't rise quickly. Mapuche warriors swarm him with clubs. He dies before he can draw his sword. This scene repeats 15 times in as many minutes. Pike stopping charges. Armored riders becoming vulnerable on the ground. The Spanish tactical advantage, cavalry shock, neutralized by a simple adaptation of their own infantry weapons. Valdivia sees his cavalry being systematically dismounted and killed. He makes the decision that should save his remaining forces. Full retreat. He orders his cavalry to break contact and ride north, abandoning the indigenous auxiliaries to cover the withdrawal. But Lautaro anticipated this too. He's positioned warriors along the retreat route. Not to stop the fleeing cavalry, they can't match the speed of panicked horses, but to harass, to slow, to exhaust the animals so they can't sustain full gallop. The pursuit lasts 6 miles. The Spanish cavalry reaches a clearing near a place called Canet. Valdivia has 42 riders left from the original 60. The horses are exhausted. The men are terrified. For the first time in the Chilean campaign, Spanish soldiers have suffered casualties that approach parity with the enemy. Usually they lose 2 or 3 men while killing hundreds. This time they've lost 18 while killing perhaps 40 Mapuche. The mathematics of conquest have changed. Valdivia attempts to establish a defensive position in the clearing. The remaining cavalry forms a circle, riders facing outward. It's the standard Spanish response to being surrounded. Create a hedgehog formation that's difficult to break. Lautaro doesn't attack immediately. He lets the Spanish sit in their defensive circle for 3 hours while their exhausted horses drink the last water from canteens. He lets them realize no reinforcements are coming. He lets them understand they're going to die here. Then, at approximately 2 p.m. on December 26, 1553, Lautaro orders the final assault. 600 warriors against 42 exhausted cavalry. But he doesn't order a mass charge. He sends warriors in waves, 50 at a time, attacking and withdrawing, refusing the decisive battle that might give the Spanish cavalry room to maneuver. It's siege warfare applied to an open field engagement. The Spanish have nowhere to retreat. They can only wait and fight and die. The battle, if you can call a systematic execution a battle, lasts 90 minutes. The Spanish fight with desperate courage. Several accounts survive from indigenous auxiliaries who escaped and reported back to Spanish authorities. They describe conquistadors fighting to the last, taking multiple wounds before falling, calling to saints and cursing their fate. Pedro de Valdivia, the conqueror of Chile, dies in that clearing. Mapuche accounts say Lautaro captured him alive and executed him personally. Spanish accounts say he died fighting. Either way, the man who founded Santiago, who claimed Chile for Spain, who believed indigenous peoples were incapable of defeating European military organization. That man dies at the hands of the stable boy he once owned. Not one Spanish soldier from Valdivia's relief force survives. 42 cavalry dead. 200 indigenous auxiliaries dead or captured. The Spanish military presence south of Concepcion is suddenly, catastrophically broken. If you find this kind of forgotten history as fascinating as we do, we'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. We believe these stories of tactical genius and resistance deserve to be told. And by subscribing, you help us ensure they aren't forgotten. Lautaro doesn't stop with this victory. Over the next 3 years, he'll refine and expand his tactics. He teaches Mapuche warriors to fight on horseback, using captured Spanish horses and teaching riding skills Lautaro learned as Valdivia's stable boy. The Mapuche become cavalry themselves, turning the Spanish advantage into a shared capability. He introduces infantry formations, lines of pike-armed warriors who can stop cavalry charges. He organizes supply systems so warriors can sustain longer campaigns instead of returning home after brief raids. He creates a command structure with himself as Toki, Supreme War Chief, coordinating multiple groups of warriors in complex operations. In February 1554, Lautaro leads 1,000 warriors in a coordinated assault on Concepcion, the second largest Spanish city in Chile. The Spanish have 200 soldiers and fortifications. Lautaro besieges the city using European siege tactics, cutting supply lines, preventing relief forces from entering, systematically weakening the defenses. After 60 days, the Spanish abandon Concepcion. They evacuate north to Santiago, leaving the entire region south of the Mal River under Mapuche control. It's an unprecedented reversal. Indigenous forces don't capture Spanish cities, but the Mapuche just did. In 1556, Lautaro plans his most ambitious operation, an assault on Santiago itself. He leads 1,500 warriors north, moving carefully, avoiding Spanish patrols, coordinating his movements like a European general. The Spanish have fortified Santiago, but they're terrified. Reports describe panic in the city, civilians fleeing, soldiers preparing for a siege they don't believe they can survive. Lautaro reaches the Mataquito River, 30 miles south of Santiago, in April 1557. He camps his warriors, plans the final assault. Victory here would drive the Spanish from Chile entirely. It never happens. On the night of April 29, 1557, a Spanish patrol commanded by Francisco de Vallegra locates Lautaro's camp and attacks at dawn. It's a small force, 50 cavalry. Against 1,500 warriors, they shouldn't stand a chance. But Vallegra catches the Mapuche sleeping, unprepared, their weapons stacked instead of ready. The cavalry charge slaughters warriors before they can organize defense. Lautaro dies in the initial attack, killed by a lance thrust before he fully wakes. He's approximately 25 years old. The Mapuche army breaks and scatters. The assault on Santiago never happens. Spanish Chile is saved by a lucky patrol finding an enemy camp by accident. But the revolution Lautaro started doesn't die with him. Act 4. The Ripple Effect. The Spanish expect Lautaro's death to end Mapuche resistance. They're wrong. What Lautaro taught, that Spanish tactics can be learned, adapted, and used against the conquistadors themselves, spreads through Mapuche communities faster than Spanish authorities can suppress it. Other war chiefs rise to continue the resistance. Capalican, Galvarino, Pelantaro. Leaders who refine Lautaro's innovations, adding their own adaptations. The Mapuche continue using pikes against cavalry. They continue organizing coordinated assaults. They continue learning from every engagement, treating warfare as a science that can be studied and mastered rather than a ritual bound by tradition. The Spanish military command in Santiago sends urgent reports to Lima and Madrid describing a crisis unlike anything encountered in the Americas. The Viceroy of Peru sends reinforcements, 500 soldiers, modern weapons, experienced officers. They achieve nothing. The Mapuche adapt faster than the Spanish can respond. By 1598, 45 years after Lautaro's victory at Tucapel, the Spanish abandon all settlements south of the Biobío River. They establish that river as a formal border. Spanish Chile to the north, Mapuche territory to the south. It's a negotiated frontier, recognized in treaties, enforced by mutual agreement. Think about what that means. The Spanish Empire, which conquered the Aztecs and Incas, which claimed territory from California to Argentina, formally recognizes it cannot conquer the Mapuche. A decentralized indigenous people with no central government, no standing army, and a population under 1 million hold off the Spanish Empire for 3 centuries. The Arauco War, the Spanish name for the Mapuche resistance, becomes the longest military conflict in the Americas. It lasts from 1536 to 1825, nearly 300 years of continuous warfare. The Spanish try everything: massive military campaigns, fortified border zones, scorched earth tactics, negotiated peace treaties. Nothing achieves permanent conquest. The Mapuche remain independent throughout the entire Spanish colonial period. They trade with the Spanish, negotiate treaties, sometimes fight alongside them against other enemies. But they never submit. They never become a colonial possession. They maintain control of their territory through military capability earned by adapting enemy tactics and making them their own. What they didn't know was that Lautaro's innovations would influence indigenous resistance movements across South America. Other peoples, the Araucanians in Argentina, the Tehuelche in Patagonia, adopt Mapuche tactics and weapons. The concept of learning from enemies, of treating warfare as something that evolves rather than something fixed by tradition, spreads wherever the Mapuche story reaches. The true impact wouldn't be understood until centuries later, when historians analyze the collapse of Spanish expansion in southern Chile. They trace it directly to December 1553, to one battle at Fort Tucapel, where a former stable boy proved that indigenous peoples could master European military tactics and use them more effectively than the Europeans themselves. The Spanish casualties tell the story. Between 1553 and 1598, Spain loses over 20,000 soldiers in Chile, killed in battle, disease, desertion. The cost bankrupts the colonial treasury. Officers refuse assignments to Chile, knowing it's a death sentence. The territory that was supposed to fund Spanish expansion through gold mines and agricultural wealth instead becomes a resource drain that never stops bleeding money and men. By the early 1600s, Spanish policy shifts from conquest to containment. The Bio River border becomes permanent. Trade replaces warfare as the primary interaction between Spanish and Mapuche territories. The Mapuche effectively achieve what no other indigenous people in the Americas managed. They force European colonizers to accept them as military equals, to negotiate rather than conquer, to acknowledge that some peoples cannot be broken by superior technology alone. Act 5, The Legacy. Lautaro dies at approximately 25 years old, killed in his sleep by Spanish cavalry in 1557. His body is never recovered. Mapuche warriors carried it away after the battle, and Spanish accounts never confirm what happened to his remains. He likely received Mapuche burial rites somewhere in the forests of southern Chile, in an unmarked location that ensured the Spanish couldn't desecrate his grave. The Mapuche remember him as the greatest Toqui, the war chief who proved the Spanish could be defeated and taught his people how to do it. His name becomes legendary, passed down through generations in oral histories that preserve his tactics, his victories, his vision of resistance through adaptation. The Spanish remember him too, but differently. Alonso de Ercilla, a Spanish soldier who fought in Chile, writes an epic poem called La Araucana in 1569, just 12 years after Lautaro's death. It's one of the most important works of Spanish colonial literature, and it portrays Lautaro as a tragic hero, noble, intelligent, worthy of respect even as an enemy. That portrayal matters. Spanish literature rarely treats indigenous leaders with such respect. But Ercilla fought in Chile. He saw what the Mapuche could do. He understood that dismissing them as savages was both factually wrong and tactically dangerous. Other Mapuche leaders continue the resistance Lautaro started. Caupolicán, captured by the Spanish in 1558 and executed by impalement, a death that becomes its own legend of defiance. Galvarino, who has both hands cut off by Spanish forces as punishment for rebellion, continues fighting with blades attached to his stumps until he's killed in battle. These aren't mythological figures. These are real men whose names appear in Spanish military records, whose actions are documented by multiple sources, whose resistance forced the Spanish Empire to acknowledge that conquest has limits. The Mapuche remain independent until 1883, 330 years after Lautaro's victory at Tucapel. Their final defeat comes not from Spanish forces but from the newly independent Chilean state, which uses modern industrial warfare, repeating rifles, artillery, coordinated military campaigns, to finally break Mapuche control of southern Chile. Even then, the defeat is incomplete. The Mapuche survive as a people, maintain their language, preserve their culture. Today, approximately 1.7 million people in Chile and Argentina identify as Mapuche. They remember the resistance. They remember Lautaro. They remember 3 centuries when their ancestors held off the most powerful empire on earth. The broader legacy extends beyond Chile. Lautaro demonstrated principles that modern military theorists recognize as fundamental to successful resistance. Learn from your enemy, adapt their tactics to your strengths, refuse to fight on their terms, make them fight on yours. These principles shape insurgency and counterinsurgency doctrine to this day. The Mapuche resistance influenced Latin American independence movements in the early 1800s. Revolutionaries like José de San Martín and Bernardo O'Higgins, who liberated Argentina and Chile from Spanish rule, studied the Arauco War and understood its lessons. If decentralized indigenous peoples could resist Spanish rule for 3 centuries, then organized independence movements with external support could succeed as well. The specific tactics Lautaro invented, using pikes to stop cavalry, organizing rotating waves of attackers to maintain continuous pressure, adapting enemy weapons and techniques. These appear in military conflicts across South America throughout the colonial period and beyond. But to focus only on tactics is to miss the deeper legacy. Lautaro proved that military superiority is never absolute, that technology alone doesn't determine outcomes, that determination and intelligence can overcome material advantages. He proved it so thoroughly that an empire known for ruthless conquest chose negotiated borders over continued warfare. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm this piece of history is worth remembering. We're dedicated to rescuing these forgotten stories from the archives. If you want to join us on this mission, please subscribe and turn on notifications. The story of the Mapuche resistance deserves to be known beyond academic circles, deserves to be understood as one of the most successful indigenous resistance movements in history. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your city or state, and tell us if you have connections to Chile, to the Mapuche people, or to stories of resistance in your own family history. These stories connect us across centuries and continents. They remind us that courage and intelligence can challenge even the most overwhelming odds. Thank you for ensuring that Lautaro and the warriors of the Mapuche resistance do not disappear into silence. Thank you for remembering that a former stable boy became a military genius who changed the course of history. Thank you for honoring the 300 years of resistance that followed his example. They refused to fall. They refused to surrender. They fought with intelligence and courage until the Spanish Empire acknowledged what Lautaro proved in 1553, that some peoples cannot be conquered, no matter what technology their enemies possess. They deserve to be remembered.